Welcome to this session of the North Central Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Center webinar series, presented to you by the National AgrAbility Project at Purdue University. My name is Paul Jones. I manage the National AgrAbility Project, and our topic for today is a changing way of life, ambiguous loss and farming. Our presenter, Emily Kreckelberg from University of Minnesota Extension. If you're not familiar with USDA's Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Network, also known as FARSAN, it is administered through the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and it was first authorized through the 2008 Farm Bill. The goal of FARSAN is to establish a network to support people in agriculture who are dealing with various stress-related issues, and there are 4 regional FARSAN centers that cover every U.S. state and territory. If you'd like basic contact information for those centers, you can go to agrability.info/farsan. And again, that's agrability.info and not agrability.org in this particular case. Those that are not familiar with AgrAbility, we are sponsored also through the USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture. And our focus is to help anybody in agriculture that has any type of disabling condition. Currently, there are 21 state AgrAbility projects around the country, and every one of those is a partnership between a land-grant university and at least one nonprofit disability services organization. The National AgrAbility Project, again, is at Purdue University through the Breaking New Ground Resource Center, and our partners on that grant include Goodwill of the Finger Lakes, Osteoarthritis Action Alliance, AgriSafe Network, Colorado State University, and Washington State University. If you want more information related to AgrAbility, you can visit agrability.org. We have approximately 170 archived webinars if you'd like to review any of those, plus contact information for all the state projects and a variety of other resources. We do want to acknowledge our support from USDA NIFA, and this slide indicates the projects and the grant numbers that we're presenting this webinar through. I want to introduce our presenter. Emily Kreckelberg is an extension educator for farm safety and health with University of Minnesota Extension. She spent her career working with farm families on a wide variety of topics, ranging from dairy production systems to mental health. Her personal experience growing up on her family's dairy farm and the challenges they faced informs the work she does today. Emily's firsthand experience with the many adversities of farming included the sale of her family's dairy herd, the destruction of a year's corn crop due to hail, and 2 immediate family members losing limbs in agricultural incidents. These experiences have shaped the way Emily approaches her work with farmers and their families, weaving together the science of production agriculture with the art of building resilience. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, turn things over to Emily for the rest of the presentation.
All right. Thank you so much, Paul. Hopefully you can see my screen okay and hear me okay. So wonderful to be on here today. Thank you all for taking the time out of your busy day to join us. We have a lot of information to cover in a really short amount of time, so I am going to probably talk pretty fast, but please, again, feel free to ask your questions along the way. I also hope that in talking fast, we will have a more formal Q&A time at the end, so you can also hang on to your questions until the end if you'd prefer as well. One thing I do want to make note of, and you probably see on this slide, another name listed, Jennifer McGuire. So Jennifer is my co-author on this work. This work does not happen without her. It is both of our baby, but she had another commitment today, so she was unable to join us, but just want you to be aware that she does work on this project as well. She is one of our extension specialists in family social science at the university. So, in brief, we have a lot of content we're going to cover in a short period of time today, but I know that there's a lot of interest in the topic of ambiguous loss and especially how it relates to farming and agriculture. So, we're doing the welcome right now. I'll provide one slide of background. We'll talk about loss and grief in agriculture. We'll talk briefly about the theoretical background of ambiguous loss. And then we'll cover building resilience, which is really the antidote, as it were, for folks experiencing ambiguous loss. We do have a program and accompanying curriculum about ambiguous loss in farming that I'll give a really brief overview of at the end, and then we'll wrap up with that Q&A that I mentioned. So just like Paul, I do want to make a few acknowledgments. First is the one on the bottom, our funding acknowledgement. So this work in ambiguous loss and farming is also supported by the North Central Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Center. So you can kind of see several ways that that center is put into action here in this work and this webinar series. Also want to acknowledge Karen Shire and Mary Jo Katras with University of Minnesota Extension for their support of this program and building the curriculum as well. Want to briefly acknowledge that University of Minnesota Extension is committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, and this work is also in line with those priorities as well. So to briefly set the stage, I think everything that I'm going to put up on this slide, most of you likely know already. So we know that mental health in agriculture is an area of concern. It has been, it is still, I would say, I find in Minnesota, we maybe had a period of time where it wasn't quite the level of concern we saw in 2018. But we are returning to that time where there is a lot of concern about the mental health of our farmers and agriculturalists. So we know that farmers face an enhanced mental burden for a wide variety of reasons. We know that there are higher suicide rates in farming. And we also know that the suicide fatality rate is higher than the accident or incident fatality rate in farming. So more farmers die by suicide than die in farm incidents each year. So this kind of sets the stage for why we're here today, and that is to specifically talk about ambiguous loss in farming, which is another piece of this mental burden, right? So what I'm going to cover today is not every single thing that a farmer deals with. This is just one piece of that, specifically ambiguous loss and unresolved grief. So before we dive into it, let's get the big question out of the way. What is ambiguous loss? It is a loss that is unclear and lacks closure. So there, that probably clears it up now, right? Maybe not. All right, so we have a little more information we're going to build on, right? And it's kind of by design that this definition is somewhat ambiguous, right? It's a little vague. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the components of ambiguous loss in order to better understand ambiguous loss, right? So the key things I want you to look at here are loss and then closure, right? So we'll kind of address both of those. So with addressing those, we need to start with talking about loss and grief in agriculture. All right, so loss, most of us have a good understanding of that. That is what is removed, right? The thing that we lost. A loss can be sudden and traumatic, right? Like a house fire, or a loss can stretch out really slowly over time in small steps, like slowly losing financial solvency over time, for example, right? So loss, the thing that's being removed. And then there's grief. So this is where that closure piece comes in, right? Because many of us typically associate, achieving closure with grief ending. So as you see on this slide here, grief is a process that is expected to end at some point in time. Right? So as I say this, as you see that on the slide, many of you are likely thinking of the long accepted 5 stages of grief. So the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. The problem with the 5 stages of grief is that they don't fit equally into all types of loss. And these 5 stages, designed and written in the way that they were, also assume that at some point the grief ends, right? Or the grieving process ends. But we know that grief can be disrupted or continue on for a very long time, depending on the type of loss, and the process for moving forward as well. And so, again, we think of these 5 stages of grief as being what we can depend on or go back to, or that's what we go through. Another thing to keep in mind, so Kubler-Ross, the author of these 5 stages of grief, originally wrote them for individuals that had received a terminal medical diagnosis. So these are the 5 stages of grief that an individual who is dying themselves goes through. And then, right, but the idea, and I think these 5 stages of grief, that became something that was really easy to grasp and for us to understand. So we kind of took that concept and applied it to all grief, right? But like I've said, that doesn't fit into all types of loss evenly, right? Loss and grief is different from situation to situation. So I want to maybe challenge some of the beliefs you held about grief and grief following these, perfect 5 stages in a cycle, and then it's over. Because we'll learn as we continue through here over the next 45-ish minutes that grief can be disrupted, right? Grief can continue for a very long time, like I've said. And talking directly about grief can help us build resiliency and can help us deal with it, right? Cope with that grief. We also know that long-term grief can compromise our mental health. And that in farming, we can have grief or see grief about a lot of different things, right? That grief may be focused on the loss of livestock, a lost investment, family members that perhaps leave the farm changing ownership, right? So lots of different things that can be grieved in a farming context. I want to spend a little more time talking about grief. So there are a variety of types of grief, all right? So there are 3 I'm going to highlight here today, but please know that there are many more. But these 3 types of grief listed here represent 3 types that we see most often in ambiguous loss situations, all right? So there's anticipatory grief, which occurs when we know that a loss is imminent, but before it's actually occurred, right? So the grieving process begins for the loss that is coming, but because the loss hasn't occurred yet, it may not be publicly acknowledged, right? And it's kind of related to another concept with a similar name, anticipatory loss, right? So basically, when the certainty of the loss isn't really established, but we're anticipating that it's still going to occur. So anxiety and grief processes can set in early if a farm is struggling for a period of time, right? So a great example of anticipatory grief as well as anticipatory stress in Minnesota, as well as many states, right? We have been struggling with highly pathogenic avian influenza. We are the #1 turkey producer in the nation, so we have a lot of turkey farms here that are impacted, as well as many chicken farms, both broilers and layers. And so, again, an example of anticipatory grief could be if I am a poultry producer and I know that the turkey farm 5 miles down the road from me tested positive for avian influenza. they are depopulating the flock, right? And what we know about this influenza is that it spreads very quickly. And so if I know it was found that near to my farm, I might think, well, it's only a matter of time, right? Like it is only a matter of time before our test comes back positive, and now we're quarantined and we're depopulating and we're having to go through this process as well, right? So you may start to experience that loss and feel that grief before the positive test even happens. I should also mention here that let's say in this example that the positive test never happens, right? The neighbor down the road finished their quarantine, they get birds back, everything's fine, quarantine is lifted, and your farm never got it. That's great. But I want to be clear that the grief that was felt, even in that anticipation, is still valid grief, right? So a person still went through a grieving process, even though a loss didn't actually occur, a full clear loss didn't happen. They were still anticipating that loss and starting to grieve it. All right, so there's anticipatory grief. And then there's disenfranchised grief. So this is the second type of grief that can develop from ambiguous loss. And like the name implies, it's a grief that's not understood or taken seriously. So there are some basic features of losses that are disenfranchised. So they're not openly acknowledged, they're not socially sanctioned, there's no public grief or mourning. Right. So when this grief is disenfranchised, the family with losses can be disconnected from their social network and feel really alienated. Right. So my colleague Jennifer, again, who's not here, she does a lot of her work with LGBTQ youth and their families, and how ambiguous loss shows up there, and studies a lot of this disenfranchised grief. Right. So you come out to your family and aren't accepted, right? But society doesn't really know how to provide community care for you, right? Because that is not something that's socially sanctioned or talked about, right? So just like in farming, loss of property, bodily injury, loss of a job or livelihood, these are all losses that need grieving. And they can affect anyone who is connected to a farm, right? And the people around the farm as well. And so recognizing and validating the losses of our own and those around us allows people to admit their feelings, right? And to acknowledge what they're going through and to grieve more publicly. And that helps them, in turn, stay better connected to their social networks as well. So that's disenfranchised grief, right? So grief that's just not understood, not taken seriously. And then lastly, we have frozen grief. And this is one that I really see showing up a lot in the farms I've worked with. And I mean, I have seen all of these types of grief show up in various ways, but frozen grief is one that really sticks with me. So this type of grief is the result of the ambiguity of not knowing whether or not an effort will be successful. Right? So frozen grief in farming can go on for years, right? While various efforts are made to try and salvage various aspects of the business, the livestock, the land, and other operations. So the uncertainty of the future of the farm doesn't allow for any family member to grieve it and move on because they're continuing to try something to save it. And they don't get a chance to let that grief run its normal course. Frozen grief is also can be marked by people who seem to have an overwhelming sense of dread, right? So this idea, again, that I feel like this loss is going to happen, kind of like anticipatory grief, but I'm just not letting myself feel it because I'm going to keep trying, right? I don't know if it's going to work, but I am going to keep trying until I know that it won't work, right? But then you are stuck in this frozen grief. So again, grief is not running a normal, quote, normal cycle. It's not running the type of cycle we would normally think it would. And again, with all three of these types of grief, we see all of them, right, not being super well understood or socially sanctioned by people, outside of our own inner circle. So that is what also makes dealing with the grief difficult, is because there's no social support typically. All right, so those are types of grief. And then briefly, I just want to discuss types of loss, right? So we're talking about grief and loss. We spent a long time on the grief piece, but now flipping back to loss, because there's a couple important distinctions to make here. So, in types of loss, for the purposes of our conversation today, we are dividing them into two types. So, there is physical loss and psychological loss. Many of us, I think, are familiar with physical loss, right? That is something physical that's gone now, an item, a person, right? Money, so a thing, right? Psychological loss is like it sounds like, right? Something psychologically that's been gone or damaged. So a relationship, right? A breakup, that's a psychological loss. The meaning of something, right? Losing the meaning of something can be a psychological loss. Losing identity. So an example we'll kind of come back to, and like Paul read in my bio, right? My dad sold our dairy herd in 2018. And he'll introduce himself as a dairy farmer, and then he kind of stops and goes, well, a retired dairy farmer, semi-retired farmer. Well, he doesn't quite know where that identity for him lies anymore. So that's just an example of how that psychological loss can show up. All right. So we have this physical loss and this psychological loss, right? So two things to think about. These are the two things to think about when we are assessing if something is an ambiguous loss or not, right? So on the next slide, I'll kind of show you what that can look like in practice. So again, from a farming perspective, physical losses, livestock, land, a person. And I want to be clear, losing a person may be death, but it could also be, right, like a child who leaves for college and then doesn't come back to the farm after they graduate, right? So they're still alive, right? But in the terms of the farm, they've been lost, right? That labor or that presence is lost. Psychological loss farm examples include relationships, within the farm and family, the loss of identity as a farmer, and loss of meaning in farming due to either internal or external factors. So let's look a little bit more at what this looks like. I personally am a visual learner, so it helps me to lay things out this way. So again, if we're trying to determine if something is an ambiguous loss, we need to really look at the physical loss and the psychological loss and the presence of one, both, or either, right? So, for example, if something has been both physically lost and psychologically lost, that is a clear loss, right? So the easiest example of clear loss would be the death of somebody, right? So again, physically, we know that they are gone. Psychologically, we also know that they have passed. So there's no question on what's been lost or not, all right? So then, and this is really here again, I'm a visual person and I just needed my table to have balance. So if there has been no physical loss and no psychological loss, it's not a loss, right? Or if there was a very quick recovery, right? Like, so for example, you get some storm damage, right, to one of your buildings. Well, you get insurance money, you get the building fixed back up. It's like it never happened. Right. So probably, initially there was a loss there, but long term, no real loss was felt, right? Because it was all resolved. So now we're really going to get into, again, the ambiguous loss piece. So what this looks like. All right. So one type is a physical loss with no psychological loss. All right. So we have physically lost something, but psychologically, it's still maintained. So the traditional example of this in the literature on the theoretical background would be a child that is missing, right? Or a soldier overseas that's missing in action. So we do not know where this person is, but we also have no confirmation that they have been killed, right? So we're going to assume until we know otherwise that they are alive. But again, we do not know where they are. Physically, they are lost. They are not present with us. They are gone. But psychologically, right, we believe them to still be alive. We believe them to still be okay. They are just missing, right? So physically gone, but still psychologically present. So a farm example of that would be, like I said, from my own family, the dairy cows have been sold, but the dairy farmer still identifies as a dairy farmer and is questioning that identity, right? That is an ambiguous loss. Because again, the cows are physically gone, but we still have the farm. The barn is still there, right? My dad still lives there. So he's still psychologically very present in that space as well, right? That mental as well as physical space. All right. So that's one type of loss, right? Physical loss with no psychological loss. And then also the opposite can be true, where there is a psychological loss, but no physical loss. So again, a historical example from the theoretical background would be a patient who has dementia, right? So this is a person who psychologically over time may be losing their faculties, right? They are not the same person that they were, but they are physically still present, right? We can still go and visit them. We can still sit next to them. We can still see them and talk to them. But again, maybe not the same person. So again, dementia as well as addiction are common examples of this type of ambiguous loss, where something is psychologically gone, but still has a physical presence. So that can, again, really complicate the grieving process. So a farming example of an ambiguous loss where something is physically present but psychologically gone. And this is a true story. So farm parents that are so preoccupied with the farm that they are negligent to their children's and families' needs, and the relationships suffer. So there was a situation where that happened. The daughter ended up attempting suicide because she just felt so lost and unsupported. Thankfully, she was okay. She is doing great now. Everybody is, right? But she was experiencing ambiguous loss and this really big grief, and she didn't know how to express that, right? She didn't even know how to define that that's what it was she was feeling. So that is a way that this can show up in farming. Now, you'll see on these boxes that they do say type 1 and type 2. So, as you've probably figured out, that just differentiates if we're talking about a physical loss or psychological loss. You know, in our work, we don't get super hung up on which type of ambiguous loss it is. We just really want people to focus on, is it ambiguous loss, right? So do you have one but not the other, physical but not psychological, or vice versa? So as we wrap up some of the kind of background on the theory of ambiguous loss, I should mention the pioneer of ambiguous loss theory is Pauline Boss, who is a professor emeritus at the University of Minnesota. And these are some pieces from the theoretical background that she provides in her book, The Myth of Closure. So some of the theoretical background includes that, like I said, it is a loss that remains unclear and thus has no closure. It is a loss that has no official verification, so it can't be clarified, cured, or fixed. It is just something that is. The loss can be physical or psychological, but with an incongruence between presence and absence. So that's the piece we just talked about on the previous slide. And the pathology lies in the external context of ambiguity, not in the individual or the family. So what this one really says, right, is that people experiencing ambiguous loss, it's not right due to some individual failing, right? Ambiguous loss occurs, like it says, within our external context. Now that we've covered some of that theoretical background, I also want to briefly talk about some assumptions that we can make about ambiguous loss. So ambiguous loss disrupts relationships. People have a psychological family, which may be the same or different from a legal or biological family, right? So you've maybe also heard people use the phrase a chosen family, right? So just keep in mind, we may have people we feel psychologically very close to, as close as family, and we may or may not be legally or biologically bound to those people. We also assume that ambiguity and loss complicates the grieving process. Grief continues on and closure does not happen. Therefore, people must learn to live with grief. Versus, like I was saying, this expectation that grief will one day end or be over. Instead, we need to flip our thinking to learning to live with grief long term. Intervention can build resiliency. So as opposed to fix the problem or the grief, we're just trying to build resiliency to make it easier to cope with. And people supporting grieving farm families must be comfortable dealing with ambiguity in the families that they support. So another thing that we just like to discuss when we are having these conversations with folks, right? That if you are going to, be talking to folks about this or supporting folks that you think are experiencing ambiguous loss, just remember that you yourself need to be comfortable with that ambiguity and that there may not be cut and dry, clear answers every time. So now switching gears to kind of our second piece. So like I mentioned, we know that when we're dealing with ambiguous loss, that grief is likely something that's never really truly going to go away. And so in the work that Jennifer and I do, which of course is an extension of the work of Dr. Boss, there's a real focus on building resilience as a means to help individuals cope with that grief and be able to live with that grief long term. But before we really dive into that, I want to set the stage on what resilience is, right? We hear a lot about resilience, about, responding to unwanted change, bounce back in adversity, etc. There are a lot of definitions of resilience. I'm somebody, right, I've worked in agriculture a long time, so I think of resilience very similarly to sustainability. Just like as a word, if I were to ask you do you know what it means? You would say, yeah. And then I'd say, okay, tell me. And every single person would give me a different definition. And every single person would be right. Right. So resilience is kind of similar. So I want to get us all on the same page with a shared definition of resilience when we're talking about ambiguous loss. So this comes from Ann Masden as well as Pauline Boss, and this is a combined definition from their work. So resilience is the process and outcome of successfully adapting to difficult or challenging life experiences, developing mental, emotional, and behavioral flexibility and adjustment to external and internal demands. So that's one. And then resilience includes both the ability to adapt to stressors, protective, and the readiness to be adaptive, even when there are no stressors, or promotive. So I would say many of us are probably more familiar with protective resilience, right? So that piece that's much more responsive, right, and adapting in the moment to things as they occur, versus promotive resilience, right, which is really about building that readiness in a time when there's not a stressor around it. So again, as we talk about resilience, this is the definition that I'm kind of working off of, right? So it is both a process and an outcome, and it includes both protective and promotive factors as well. But I really want to spend time focusing on these resilience strategies, right? So this slide shows 6 different groups of strategies for building our resilience so that we can live well with our losses. So these strategies have been studied and applied by Dr. Boss and all of us that work in ambiguous loss for a long time. So again, just like with the types of grief, there are many, many more resilient strategies than what you're seeing here. But again, these are the 6 from the research and literature that are found to help the best with individuals coping with ambiguous loss and dealing with that grief that may never end. So we're going to do an individual slide for each type here. So I'll just give the quick, here's what it is, and then we'll dive into each one. So there's reconstruct identity, so about redefining who you are, adjusting mastery, accepting what we can and cannot control, normalizing ambivalence, which is one of my favorites, which is all about understanding that conflicting feelings are normal. Revising attachment, which is about coming to terms with new and changing relationships. Finding meaning, which is about identifying and making meaning from the loss. And then discovering hope, so being comfortable with ambiguity. So we will dive into these here. So for each one, we'll kind of talk about what it is, how to facilitate it, as well as practices or attitudes that could make it difficult as a strategy. I also want to say at the top that when we work both with people we're training in this curriculum and farm families, we really emphasize that the idea is not that everybody becomes a master in all 6 of these strategies. It's really about finding maybe just the 1 or 2 that resonate the most with you and that feel the most approachable to you. And then perhaps over time, as you get more comfortable with one strategy, building in and trying another one as well. So I just want to make it clear that this is not an all or nothing. You need to try to be doing all of these things simultaneously, because that is not sustainable. So again, we really emphasize picking 1 or 2 strategies, again, that really resonate with the individual. So one of those strategies is reconstructing identity. So that's really about redefining who you are now, defining the psychological family, and reviewing your family boundaries, right? So we need to acknowledge that, changing our identity can certainly feel like we're losing a way of life. But if you know from our title of this program, we really emphasize it being a changing way of life, right? So yes, there is loss, and losses can be challenging, but there's also opportunity, right? So we really want to take the focus away from loss and focus it more on change, right? So a farm family example, discontinuing the livestock enterprise might feel like we are no longer hog farmers, but maybe we're still crop farmers, or we're involved in agriculture in another way, right? An example from my own family's experience. So my dad no longer dairy farms, right? But the farm is still sitting there. The pasture is still sitting there, and the pasture's full of maple trees. So now my dad taps all the maple trees in our pasture and makes syrup each spring. So that is a way that he's been able to stay connected to our land, but in a completely different way, right? And provide care and stewardship of the land in a different way. So that's one example of what this can look like in practice. So an important way to define who you are is to start, with who you love and who you consider to be family. So be clear about your psychological family. That can also help, right? As we construct our own identity, is having a really strong feeling of who are the people we feel most attached to and supported by, right? And once it's clear that those things are, or, were a part of your psychological family, it can really help us move forward and define what we do and don't have anymore. And recognizing that over time, our psychological family might change and no longer include some things. So, lastly, it can be very difficult to restructure your identity if you are stuck on a former identity or set of activities, right? So, just general stubbornness, like, nope, I have always been a dairy farmer. I will always be a dairy farmer. I cannot be anything else. That's just not possible, right? Well, that makes it really difficult to move forward. All right, I got to step on the gas here a little bit. So, adjusting mastery, which is all about recognizing that the world is not always fair, right? And so that we may need to externalize blame, and basically enhance our own sense of mastery and master our own internal processes, right? So it includes this sense of competence or our ability to control things, right? So perhaps you've thought to yourself, like, I just feel so out of control, or I don't like feeling out of control, right? Well, maybe, and again, in the case of ambiguous loss, we cannot control that loss is ambiguous. We cannot control that this grieving process is not going to end. What we can control is our mastery over that situation, right? So again, we can facilitate this by really mastering our internal functioning and processes through self-regulation. So sleep, meditation, right? Examining the functioning of our systems and recognizing, right, that sometimes the world is not fair, right? Certain systems are not fair to everyone or everything, right? That is a part of this process, is being able to recognize that. So people can struggle with adjusting mastery when they continue to see their loss as a personal failure, or if they're pressuring themselves to simply get over it, right? And the fact that they can't get over it is, again, failure. So continuing grief is a sensible reaction to a loss that never ends, but it's not a failure, right? And so again, a piece of adjusting mastery is understanding, again, that blame can be externalized, and that when we experience loss, it is not due to personal failure. Again, the pathology of ambiguous loss lies within the external context. All right, normalizing ambivalence. So if you are familiar or have ever heard of both and thinking, that's the simplest way that I can describe this, right? So ambivalence is simply having mixed feelings and understanding that we are going to have conflicted feelings about things and that is normal, right? And we can feel both good and bad, right? We can feel both anger and sadness and happiness and guilt and joy. We can feel all of those things. So, again, ambivalence kind of sounds like ambiguous. So I like to be clear. Ambiguous is something that is unclear, and ambivalent is something that is mixed, right? So ambivalence is having a mixed feelings or attitudes towards something. So that's, like I mentioned, both and thinking. So that's something that I learned many years ago in therapy, right? That something can be both really exciting and be something you're very passionate about and makes you very happy, and be something that, right, makes you so stressed you want to cry. And that's okay that it's both of those things, right? So we really facilitate this by seeking external support, right? Being able to share these feelings out loud with others. Journaling or processing those ambivalent feelings in another way can also be helpful. What can hinder normalizing ambivalence is hiding that you're feeling conflicted, right? Just denying that you wish it was over, right? Pretending like, oh no, you have very clear feelings. It's all good. That can really hinder moving through this process and building that resiliency. Revising attachment, right? Being attached to something or a certain outcome can make it difficult to adjust to a new reality. So, learning to change our sense of attachment to a certain outcome can create space and comfort with a new approach, right? So, this is really about kind of changing the importance of what was lost, grieving that you have lost that, but also celebrating what you still have, right? Um, and really, this is facilitated by the development, or in some cases, redevelopment um, of relationships. All right. So it can really be hard to revise attachment if you aren't willing to intentionally let go of things, right? Like, well, we have always been a dairy farm, and I don't care what anybody says, this farm should only be a dairy farm and nothing else. And I am going to dig my heels in and not change my opinion, right? Not being able to give up that attachment to tradition or history or whatever it may be, is again going to hinder our ability to revise those attachments and to build resilience. So, finding meaning is one of my favorite resilience strategies. And it's really about, like it says, right? Let the loss have some sort of meaning. Don't let it just be an ugly thing that we try to ignore. It is something that happened, but it happened for a reason, right? Or it happened and it had meaning, right? We found meaning in what happened. So it's really about developing and internalizing that meaning of the loss, giving the loss a name, right? And really appreciating maybe what the loss brought on, right? Again, what was the meaning of this loss? So, for example, we had one farm that we had worked with. Their son had cancer. He unfortunately did pass away. They knew pretty early in his diagnosis that it was going to be terminal, right? And so that was a really difficult time. But when you talk to this family, the first thing they mention is how it brought their whole family together for a few months, right? Kids that were living away from home, that were at college, etc. Everybody came home, right, to be with this family member. And so that was a spectacular way that those parents were able to find meaning, right, in the loss of their son, in the loss of that security of that family member being there, knowing that it also provided this opportunity for them to be together as a family. So, some impediments to meaning making can really stem from isolation, right? Or a desire to seek revenge, right? To avenge the loss or to get back at whoever you think may be guilty for this, right? And really separating ourselves. So, finding meaning is most effective in groups, right? In social circles with other folks. All right, one last one here as we wrap up. So, discovering hope. This is really about being comfortable with the ambiguity of your loss and life and having hope for a brighter future, right? Now, I want to be clear, discovering hope is not about, you know, toxic positivity or toxic optimism, like everything will be okay all the time, right? You can still be realistic, but also have hope that things will get better, are getting better, right? We do this by laughing at, absurd situations we've been through, right? I have two family members that are missing limbs. That's funny. There are a lot of pirate jokes and stuff in my family, right? That's a way we build resilience, is by laughing at the absurdity of our situation. People may also facilitate discovering hope via spirituality. Kind of similar to adjusting our mastery, this is also where we can kind of redefine justice and redefine what justice may mean for us individually, what truly is fair and just in this world. Um, and similar to that, right? Defining what we're able to control for ourselves, right? It can be hard to discover hope again if we stay really isolated, especially staying isolated from others who know our situation, and also insisting that we have all the answers and there's no reason to discover hope, right? Like I don't need to cope with this because I have it all under control, right? So those are the resilience strategies. I did mention that we do have a program that dives into all of this a lot deeper. So the idea is Jennifer and I can train folks in both our workbook and our curriculum to present this information to farm families. So we're short on time, so I'm not really going to go through it right now because I want to be able to answer some questions here. But please know that we do have that program. If you want to learn more about it, you are welcome to send me an email. So if you're interested in being somebody who can go out and talk to farm families about ambiguous loss, again, please reach out. Here's our references. So big thank you. I want to leave that slide up for a minute just so that you can jot down mine and Jennifer's contact information if you would like to have it. So with that, I know I went a few minutes longer than I wanted to, but we still have about 6 minutes before the top of the hour. So if there are questions or anything from folks, I appreciate you kind of sitting through while I blasted through these slides as fast as I could.
Well, thanks so much, Emily, for the presentation on an important topic that's not well understood by many people. So I think at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Ed Shelton. He's going to kind of pilot our Q&A session. Again, we do have the option for you to raise your hand. If you'd like to ask a question verbally, I'll try to keep my eyes out for that, and we can try to unmute your microphone. Ed?
Okay. Yeah, we've got 3 or 4 questions right now. I have them on a slide, but I don't think I'm going to try to put the slide up because we always get more questions and then I can't see them when they come in. So we'll just start out. A couple comments came in fairly early. Art, and we're going to let, if Art's still on, I'd like him to maybe clarify a little more on this. Early on, psychosocial models may be more fitting to look at through looking at rural networks and families, not individual focus. So, Art, if you're still there, would you mind jumping on, or Emily, feel free to throw in your thoughts as well, or anytime.
Yeah, I'm distracted now looking at all the questions in the chat. On the psychosocial models, I will be honest, my degrees are in animal science and ag ed. That's really Jennifer's cup of tea there. So I don't feel comfortable addressing questions on that piece just because that is not my academic background. So I'll just leave that one there. But I did see Jenny made a comment about using humor for people who have gone through a loss. And I so wish I could have spent a little more time talking about that, but I was running short on time. So do I have any tips for ag agents and how they can use humor to support farmers experiencing loss? So the first thing I would say maybe feels a little bit like a no-brainer, but read the room. Right. So certainly there are some farmers that aren't going to respond to jokes and humor as well. That's just not their thing. So, my tip is I would say if this is a farmer or family that you've built a good relationship with, or that they are the type that does joke or is a little more sarcastic, right? That's where you can certainly again, provide little sarcastic comments, or again, I really like to focus on like if situations are absurd, right? That's a great way by just pointing out like, Don't you just feel like this is so silly, right? Like even just saying a comment like that, right? Like, isn't this just absurd that you even have to deal with this? That's a way where you can also kind of take temperature of like, is humor going to help here or isn't it? Right. So that's the best advice I can give on the humor piece is, of course, make sure that it's a person that seems to utilize humor in other areas. And of course, knowing that it's not about making fun, right, or being malicious. Again, really focus on just pointing out situations being absurd or awkward.
Okay. Let's see. What else do we have? Art had another comment, that there's a point that farming is an annual risk-prone business by nature, and this backdrop going into it. I think that was again early on in the talk. Another comment from Bev, which came in before you specifically mentioned this about the situations like dementia and Alzheimer's being definitely a loss, but of maybe not a physical loss yet. And so, did have one question that I don't think you saw because it came directly to me.
Mhm.
Do you have ideas about how to make people aware that ambiguous loss exists and that perhaps they might be experiencing it? Are there awareness campaigns about this topic that maybe we should know about?
Yeah, well, maybe you're looking at the awareness campaign right now, right? That's such a great question. And, I will say that yes, as Jennifer and I have done this work, we've been working on this project for about 5 years now. That comes up a lot, right? With people being like, oh, I had no idea that this thing was in fact ambiguous loss, or right, or that's, I had no idea. That's why my neighbor has not been able to quote get over something. So I would say part of that is just sharing with people, right? Share that you came to this webinar and that you learned about this. I would say you can find a lot of great information online. I mean, if you Google ambiguous loss, the first, I don't know how many hits will be all information from the University of Minnesota. So there's a lot of great stuff you can find there. Pauline does run an online course that you can take just about ambiguous loss in general, not specific to farming. Um, but yeah, so I would say just with awareness, it's talking about it, right? And I would
Hmm.
say a way that we communicate with folks. Because, right, you don't want to say ambiguous loss, right? That's like big, nobody really knows what that means. So we talk about it in our program as feeling stuck, right? So, and that was something that came from one of the farmers we piloted this with, was like they had just felt so stuck. And it turns out, right, when we're feeling stuck or paralyzed from making a decision, it's typically because there's either a loss already involved or a loss that we feel may be imminent. So that may be a way to have that conversation with somebody if they are, if you think they might be experiencing ambiguous loss, but again, saying those words maybe doesn't feel appropriate.
Hmm.
Maybe it's talking about feeling stuck, right? And maybe that stuck feeling is because you're feeling some grief about something. So that's a way that we've approached it in doing this work. Hopefully that kind of gets at your question. One thing I want to mention related to that, I know there might be some other questions coming in, and I know we're at 3:01, but I didn't say this in the presentation, and that is that, losses, including both clear and ambiguous losses, can kind of happen all at once simultaneously, right? So somebody may be experiencing a very clear loss, like a death, but there are little ambiguous losses that maybe have come along with that clear loss, right?
Hmm.
Or they're experiencing other losses completely independent of that clear loss, right? But just knowing that we know nothing in life happens cleanly and neatly and one at a time. It's all happening at once. So just being aware as well. Again, that you may think, well, this person is having a really clear loss, but there may be other losses kind of intertwined in there as well.
Okay. I will say I originally heard the concept at a presentation at Eden. It wasn't last fall. It wasn't from Minnesota, but I have a feeling you probably had something to do with training the person that I heard. But what stuck with me was the way she described it was it's a loss that nobody sends you a card for. And that just like, oh, okay. Yeah, that makes that hits. So, okay, you had lots of compliments. One comment wasn't really a question from Dakota. So just to note that immigrant and migrant farmers are under extra levels of stress and hostility at this particular time. So, something for everybody to take into consideration. Um,
Yes, and I will add that we are actively working on adapting pieces of this program, specifically right now for some of our tribal communities in Minnesota. But we have also had requests for immigrant and first generation farmers. So that is something we're having conversations, but we don't have a timeline on that yet.
sure.
But just know that those are certainly pieces that come up in this work and that we are aware of our shortcomings of this particular program that maybe doesn't address all of those pieces. But yes, thank you, Dakota, for acknowledging that. I appreciate it.
Think that is all of the questions. Like I said, lots of compliments. Paul, at this point, I'll turn it back over to you, I believe.
Okay, well, thank you again to everybody that's participated, especially to Emily for the presentation. We are recording this, and we'll have that hopefully up on our website by the end of this week or early next week. Just a quick reminder to please give us feedback when that poll hopefully pops up on your screen when we finish. We do these North Central Farsan webinars twice a year, so you'll probably be getting a notification sometime in a couple months about our next one. So again, thank you to everybody. Thank you, Emily, and we wish you a good rest of the day.
Thank you all for your time today.